Hi, I'm Shannon Hogue, the Global Head of Solutions Engineering here at Karat. This is kind of a dream job for me because as a woman from a non-traditional background in tech, I've had my fair share of interview horror stories. So back in the 90s, I taught myself how to code, and I moved from the Midwest to San Francisco right out of high school, and I started my career as a developer. And I can't say how many opportunities I've missed because I don't have a top 10 computer science school on my resume, but I can say that I've experienced interviewers walk into the interview, look at my resume and say, oh, I must be in the wrong room. And I've even had a candidate for a role on my team ask me out in the middle of an interview process. So, a bit of horror there. But as a white female, I also recognize that there are others who have to contend with even more bias than I do. So working for a company that's trying to make hiring more efficient and equitable is something that really speaks to me at a personal level. At Karat, we've conducted over 70,000 technical interviews on behalf of companies hiring software engineers, and it's our mission to make every interview fair, predictive, and enjoyable. Now, hiring efficiency is one of the main reasons that engineering leaders come to Karat for help with their interviews, especially for fast-growing teams or organizations with a lot of churn. It could be a full-time job just to keep up with all the interviews that your team requires. And I'm sure folks in this virtual room have seen examples of this firsthand, but making your team spend their time interviewing as opposed to shipping software is a huge drain, both from a financial and a morale standpoint. This is something we hear loudly from the majority of engineering leaders that we surveyed earlier this year. And another reason why a company might turn to Karat is to make their hiring more equitable by adding consistency. Many organizations are just flat out bad at interviewing, and without consistent, high quality interviews, it's impossible for leaders to identify sources of bias in their process, which is more important than ever as businesses are continuing to make commitments around building more inclusive teams. Because we're able to separate the assessment from the decision-making process, it gives us a unique vantage point into the rest of the recruiting and hiring pipeline. And we're able to use the data and insights from our interviews to help companies develop better hiring practices at various stages of the process. We break the hiring process down into 4 key segments: the job description, sourcing, the technical evaluation, and the on-site and decision, which we're going to go through today. The first step to structuring an efficient and equitable hiring program is to perform a job analysis and create a list of relevant competencies. We always start here because if you don't have a good job description, you're not going to get good candidates. The job description is your first opportunity to formalize the attributes that you want in your successful team members. So please make sure that these attributes are measurable and inclusive. For a typical engineering role, this could include project discussions, algorithms, or talking through code reviews. And these competencies are clearly defined and all can be measured in an objective and structured way. One of the most important factors in evaluating technical competencies is designing your assessment to mimic real-world working conditions. A mock coding exercise in Google Docs doesn't do that, and actually neither do whiteboard interviews. In fact, North Carolina State University recently shared a great study showing that whiteboard tests give little signal other than which candidates may suffer from anxiety issues. Also, if you have a 60-minute technical interview and the question prompt is 4 pages long, what are you really assessing? Are you someone who is a mediocre developer but a great speed reader is going to have an extra 3 to 6 minutes on the test. So you've effectively given them a 10% head start because of a skill that has little or no impact on their day-to-day work. Finally, some interview questions intentionally test a candidate's ability to handle ambiguity by leaving out key pieces of information, but those can also insert bias. Cultural biases in particular encourages women and people of color to accommodate others. And this bias often penalizes assertiveness by interpreting it as aggression or bossy. And people internalize those cultural norms. One thing that we've observed over 70,000 technical interviews is that women are statistically less likely to ask follow-up questions or clarifying questions unless specifically prompted because they don't want to come across as bitchy. At the very least, if you are assessing someone's ability to handle ambiguous situations, tell them that's what you're doing. That way a candidate knows they won't be dinged for asking probing questions during the interview. Now, the ugly truth. I can't stress enough that you should not be looking for ninjas or rock stars or whatever we're calling the developers this week. That's a kind of coded language, and it's an instant red flag for many candidates from underrepresented groups because it can't be measured objectively. I've even heard of companies that are hiring based on greatness. And again, it's impossible to measure, and it's a huge bias trap because recruiters, interviewers, and hiring managers will project themselves onto that definition without even knowing it by thinking, hey, I'm great, and this person is like me. We even went to the same school, they must be amazing. And that thinking isn't a predictive or efficient way to identify talent, and it definitely is not equitable. In fact, countless studies have shown that women are less likely than men to apply for roles they aren't 100% qualified for. According to one Harvard Business Review study, women are twice as likely than men to not apply for a job because I was following the guidelines about who should apply. The bottom line is that a job posting looking for supportive team players isn't going to cost you nearly as many male applicants as a posting for a 10x dev who wants to move fast and break things will cost you women. So please keep that in mind as you review your job descriptions and think about the people that you're self-selecting for with your language. Now, once you have your jobs posted, it's time to source and vet candidates. At some point in your sourcing process, the team needs to figure out how many candidates you need to bring in to make a hire. And this number will vary by company. But for organizations hiring hundreds or even thousands of interviews, this means sourcing thousands of candidates, which is especially true for early career, new grad, and intern roles, most of whom are being interviewed now during the fall recruiting season. For early career hires, it's getting easier to make your recruiting more inclusive because virtual career fairs and job boards mean that you can be at a lot more schools. And for a more diverse pipeline, write good job descriptions, pick schools with the diverse populations, and let the candidates self-select by opting in. The important part about candidate intake to keep in mind is that if you have a competency-based job description, figure out a way to filter candidates based on some indicator of those competencies. Just 12% of candidates who apply directly to company websites make it past the application review, which can be a problem for candidates with non-traditional backgrounds like myself. And even fewer, usually between 5 to 10%, actually make it to a technical assessment based on a recruiting screen. And what's really ugly about this is that if you're only recruiting from the top 10 computer science schools, then you're creating artificial scarcity and constraining the diversity of your pipeline to the diversity of those schools. Carnegie Mellon's undergrad population was less than 4% Black and less than 2% Hispanic. There's no way you're going to hit your DEI goals without opening up new talent pipelines. And I know a lot of people who get really into school rankings, but honestly, once you're past the first 5 to 10 schools, we see a significant flattening of the curve on technical interview performance. Our data shows that there isn't a material difference in the performance of candidates from Arizona State, which is borderline top 30 school in a lot of rankings, and emerging programs like University of Maryland, Baltimore County. Now, basketball fans may remember UMBC for knocking off Virginia in the 16 seed a few years ago, but more relevant, it's a school with a growing computer science program and a student population that's 25% Black or Hispanic. And there are tons of these schools out there. And now that you have candidates in the pipeline, it's time to assess their competencies. So my last time joining Peter and the CTO Connections team, I went into more detail about how to engineer technical interviews in a way that gives you the best hiring signal. So I will spare you those details at this time, but if anyone's interested, I'm sure that we can share the link afterwards. But we measure the success of our hiring signal based on how aligned our technical interview recommendations are with the on-site interview results. But taking a step back from the interview itself, you can actually measure the predictiveness of your entire hiring pipeline. And if you don't already have a structured hiring process, a good place to start is by tracking the outcomes at each stage of the process. On-site to offer rates are a key metric at Karat. Because we align our assessments to our clients' hiring bars, the higher our recommendation, the higher probability of a candidate getting an offer. It's also important to measure your candidate experience. You can do this by collecting candidate feedback after the fact, but a good leading indicator of how your candidates are feeling about your process is the drop-off rate by stage. If you're using some kind of take-home test or automated code challenge to expand your candidate vetting, like we mentioned in the last section, expect about a 50% drop-off rate. If it's significantly worse than that, you probably want to think about how much work you're making the candidates put in. That rate will vary depending on role. It's common for university recruiting to have better sign-up rates, which is good because automated code tests can be a great and cheap competency-based filter to expand your early career recruiting pipeline. But the number gets worse as you get to more senior levels. Once candidates get to the technical interview, we also see slightly higher performance numbers out of code test sourcing than resume screens. After the initial intake process, you'll likely see 10 to 20% of candidates drop out at each subsequent stage, especially if you have a delay in your decision-making that kills the momentum of a candidate's interview loop. For candidates who pass the technical assessment and are invited on-site, we tend to see pretty low drop-off rates, which are most often due to candidates accepting another job. However, if you're having a problem keeping diverse candidates in your interview pipeline, this is the time to do some digging. Is there a phase where underrepresented minority candidates are dropping off at a higher rate? Is there a particular team or even an interviewer that has higher drop-off rates? This is where reviewing and training interviewers can be key to creating a more inclusive process. High drop-off rates aren't just a sourcing problem, they're also a red flag about your overall candidate experience, which brings me to the ugly. Please be kind to your candidates, not just for their sakes, but for yours. If you're giving out a 4 to 16-hour code assessment, it's not only a red flag for candidates, but it also means you're having a really hard time generating a useful hiring signal. Remember, you're looking for 3 to 5 core competencies at this stage. So train your interviewers to deliver questions in a consistent and clear way, and you'll get a signal that's way more predictive than this kind of full-time side hustle on the screen. Plus, you won't have to spend hours grading people's homework. A 60-minute technical interview should really be all you need, especially if you have a structured rubric to evaluate and compare candidates. This last stage of the process is all about getting your final interviews and comparing candidates before offers are made. I'm going to say this in every presentation I give until the day that I retire, and then probably a few times in my sleep after that. But a structured scoring rubric is the best first thing you can do to start improving your hiring signal. Consistency requires a structured scoring rubric that forces your recruiters and interviewers to make observations rather than judgments. Checking a box to confirm that a candidate produced a fully working solution during a paired coding interview sends a clear and measurable hiring signal that's easy to compare across candidates. Structured rubrics help interviewers and hiring managers by making it clear which competencies matter and by creating an objective scale to assess those competencies. Furthermore, the act of filling out a structured rubric will force your interviewers to objectively confront their biases because each evaluation is backed by rigorous definition that you can audit and you can defend. And that not only puts candidates on a level playing field, but it improves your hiring signal overall. But how can you tell if the signal you're getting from your hiring data is good? Now, I'm going to geek out a little bit because alignment engineering is at the core of what I do, but here's an example of a poor hiring alignment from an anonymous company and arguably poor sourcing, but that's a different conversation. The application review for direct applicants here is so rigorous that only 8% of them are getting through, but 80% of them pass the tech screen. This review was more rigorous than candidates from any other source, which are passing the tech screen sub 70% levels. This is bad alignment because you're creating false negatives for 10% of the candidates that come through that channel. A couple things about direct applications that are important to remember. One is that they're active candidates as opposed to passive ones, like you get from prospecting or recruiting, which means that they're hungry to work for you. We often see higher close rates from direct agency sources than prospecting because you know they're active job seekers. And two, assuming this company didn't have horribly non-inclusive job descriptions, they didn't. We checked. This is going to be the most diverse set of candidates you can source because it's entirely outside of your existing network, which based on the referral profiles, which let's just say was monochromatic. The comparatively high on-site to offer rates prove this out. This was a candidate pipeline that was being over-filtered and under-interviewed. So why was that? Well, there's one really ugly outlier in this data set. So look, I am the first to admit that I love referrals as much as the next girl. Referrals are the cheapest recruiting that 2 slices of deep dish and a pitcher of beer can buy. And they can be a great way to grow your company through your network. But the weight and the bias that a lot of companies give to referrals, that gets real ugly real fast. If you're not assessing referrals in the same consistent and structured way for the rest of your pipeline, it's a problem. And in this case, the referral pipeline underperformed in both the application review and the tech screen. And yet the offers went out at a significantly higher rate to referral candidates. It's not unusual for us to see higher on-site to offer ratios going to lower performing referral candidates than any other source. And I can't count the number of times that one of our account managers came to my team asking for sourcing info on candidates that didn't meet their bar that got hired anyways. And most often it was a referral. This prevents companies from diversifying their teams with an inclusive process, and it lowers the overall hiring bar. Honestly, every time I give one of these talks, I inevitably get asked, how can we hire more diverse talent without lowering our hiring bar? And it drives me nuts because that's toxic and pervasive theme that that inclusive hiring means lowering your bar. And that's just flat out not true. Our low bar candidates aren't the ones applying to our company website from HBCUs and coding academies. They're the ones that we're playing fantasy football with. I started off this talk with a few interview related experience I've had with bias, but those aren't even the most common forms of bias for women and underrepresented minorities in tech. Watching a female colleague share an idea only to be ignored until a male in the room mentions the same thing and everyone responds happens more often than any of us care to admit. And when that happens in a hiring panel, that can translate to seeing female candidates being rejected or passed over for not being as ambitious or strategic as their male counterparts, and overlooking the opinions of female leaders in the hiring panel. And again, structured scoring rubrics are a great way around that by forcing everyone to justify their arguments with data. Doing these talks and events over the past year has made me realize two things. One, we build the culture that we hire into. If we're seeing candidates who are rejected based on conscious or unconscious bias, it means that we've allowed an internal culture where that can happen in the first place. And two, interviews change lives. And the more diverse your workplace, the more diverse your friendship circle, which I argue cannot just heal corporate America and tech, but it can help heal the world. My hope moving forward from today is by writing more inclusive job descriptions, creating competency-based sourcing filters, conducting technical interviews that are predictive, fair, and enjoyable, and holding every candidate to the same consistent hiring standard, we can not only make our engineering teams more diverse, but also raise our hiring bar in the process. Thank you.